Working, cool. Good morning. Welcome to our 2020 National Journal Member Summit. Thank you all for being with us first thing in the morning. I am still waking up. I have a 2-month-old at home, and we had a fun night last night, so I'm excited to join you all as well. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get the program started. One is when you walked in, you were handed a packet. In that packet actually is an example, and I would call it a prototype of our latest product launch that we'll be launching throughout 2020. We're hiring an entirely new analyst staff. I think we've hired about 6 to 8 folks so far that are going to be building detailed profiles on every public policy professional and influencer in the country. So when we get to the end of this, it'll be about 40,000 profiles of government officials, folks like yourself, as well as folks that are in the states that are working on public policy. So we're really excited about that. If you have any questions about it or want to ask for more details, you certainly can get that from your dedicated advisors who are here today. And certainly, as you all probably know very well, we'll be in touch throughout the year. Now getting to the program, really excited about today and really setting the stage on 2020. I think that's probably the central focus of almost all of us in the room. And we'll start today with a brief from our Senior Vice President of Product Strategy and Consulting, Luke Hartig, who's going to walk us through the campaign staffs. Who's on the campaign staffs? What are their expertise? Where may they be moving the candidates when it comes to policy positions? So really excited for Luke's brief. And then after Luke, we'll take 10 to 15-minute break, and then we'll have Charlie come up and do what Charlie does best. So with that said, Luke.
Well, thanks so much, Kevin, for the warm intro, and thanks everybody for being here today. See some familiar faces in the crowd and really excited to talk about some of our work. So as Kevin said, I run a couple of businesses at National Journal that focus on doing people research. And today we'll talk about the people, the networks, the funders, everybody who's around the 2020 Democratic candidates, to give you a feel of how you can prepare for the election, how you might think about influencing the campaigns, and maybe a little bit of a crystal ball on where things might actually come out. I run 2 different businesses at National Journal. One, the people product business that Kevin just mentioned, these deep people profiles. See if I can advance the slides. Sorry. Should I point it somewhere, guys? All right. I'll riff for a minute while we figure this out. So I run 2 businesses at National Journal, and the core of both these businesses is doing deep research on people and organizations, the most influential people and organizations, how they're driving public policy issues, how they're connected to one another. Perfect. There we go. There's the slides. And we do coverage of a wide range of issues, everything from tax reform, random small kind of arcane taxes that are only relevant to your particular industry, Medicare, state and local issues, complex government contracting issues, you name it. If it's something that you're probably spending your time on, we've probably covered it in some way or another. So the work tends to be very custom, very relevant to your particular strategy. But one thing we've found is a unifying theme for all of our clients, aside from tax reform, that was a unifying theme. But the other thing we found is a consistently unifying theme is the elections, and particularly the presidential elections. So we've been doing this work for about 9 months or so now, mapping the networks around the candidates. We initially started with, I think, 10 candidates. Today we'll just talk about the top 6 in the race based off of most recent polling and kind of, I think, who people expect will still be at the top of things at the end of the day. We started doing this type of analysis of the elections back in 2016. And in 2016, which was also the year that we lost, we were kind of like a lot of new businesses, right? We had a series of good early wins. We had more than our fair share of early losses. We're trying to kind of build our momentum. And it turned out that that momentum came in the form of Donald J. Trump. And what I mean by that was we can debate his overall economic performance among players in this room, but for us at the National Journal, he was most definitely a job creator. We had so many people who came to us after President Trump won election and said, who are all these people around him? He was bringing in all these unconventional voices. Where are they coming from? Where does he get his influence? Who's going to fill the key positions in his administration? Now, this race is very different. There's probably no Trump in the Democratic side of things in this particular race. But I do think that some of the dynamics around the Democratic race right now are more uncertain than they've been at any time in history. And so for that reason, I think understanding the people around them is highly important. A few things jump out for me. The progressive bloc is more diverse than it's ever been. The traditional power centers of the progressive bloc don't hold the same influence that they used to. You have upstarts like Bernie and all of the kind of progressive candidates around him that he's brought along. You have a huge amount of grassroots activism, everything from the Sunrise Movement to Black Lives Matter and kind of everything in between. You've got the centrists who arguably powered Democrats into regaining control of the Congress in 2018. It's a diverse space. And each one of the candidates we're going to talk about today, I think, taps into a different part of that and has a different base from which they're speaking. So let me just talk to you a little bit about how we started this research and give you a little bit of our kind of methods laid down. And bear with me here, but I think this is important to kind of understand the basis of how we think about understanding the candidates. So first of all, when we set out to look at the candidates, we look at their networks holistically speaking, right? We look at if they're currently in office, we look at their staff. If they were formerly in office, we look at their staff. We look at the campaign staff. We look at family and personal networks, friends, colleagues, former college roommates, anything that we can come up with that indicates who are the people who are really influential around them. And we take a broad look at their donor network. All of this starts with kind of the basic supposition that people and organizations really matter, that the connections at an interpersonal level really, really matter, and that whoever wins the nomination is most likely, although not a certainty given President Trump, there's always a Trump asterisk because he blew up the playbook in so many ways, but most likely they're going to be tapping some of the leaders from some of the most important institutions on the progressive side of things. So when we think about what are those essential networks and what is kind of like the pathway to the nomination, we think about it as kind of what we call 6 essential campaign networks. Democratic establishment, for us, those are the typical ones like the DCCC, DSCC, DNC, state Democratic parties, also the previous 2 Democratic candidates, so Hillary for America, Obama for America. It's the primary ground game, and that's a little bit of overlap there, but who are the people they're putting on the ground in the states? Are they building a really quality ground team there? Progressive advocates, this can be kind of traditional progressive advocates, your traditional mainstream environmentalist groups like NRDC and others. It can also be some of the more populist and progressive groups that I talked about at the outset. Policy advisors, who are those wonks? Who are the people who are really driving their ideas, their thinking? These people in some sense are less important for winning the nomination, but are definitely more important when you're thinking about who might be the core of a future administration should a Democrat win this year. And finally, industry, of course, as everybody's tracking in our current environment and given the jobs that you all do every day, this is a bit of a double-edged sword in our current environment. Nobody wants to go out and say they're sort of the Democratic candidate of big business, but nonetheless, having the support of some of our more successful people in the business sector, having their financial support in particular is extremely important. So we still think it's an important network to watch. One thing I would just say at the outset here is that everything you're seeing here is available in your deck. So I know that sometimes these slides can be a little bit small, but feel free to follow along your deck if you'd like to. This is just a quick overview of the way we've broken down every single candidate. You'll find these overview slides at the back of your deck that has each of the candidates in the middle and how we rank them on the range of different factors around them. But let me jump into and give you kind of a peek under the hood of what we do, right? So bear with me. I know these slides can be a lot if you haven't seen them already, but this is the entirety of the networks that we've mapped around the 2020 candidates. There are several thousand people and organizations in here that are connected in some way, in some relevant way to the candidates. A couple of key takeaways from this slide, and then we'll jump into some of the more specifics about the candidates. So first of all, if you look at the slide, the one thing to understand is that it's all about a race for talent, and particularly a race for early electoral talent. That big cluster in the middle there, that is all of the people who powered President Obama to victory, who supported Hillary Clinton's campaign. And if you look at the people who are competing most aggressively for that talent, it's been Buttigieg, it's been Warren, and it's been Biden. Warren, perhaps a little bit surprising, but it's something she did very early on, which is to realize that winning over some of that key establishment ground game was going to be essential to her overall strategy. The three candidates you see on the edge have their own reasons for being on the edge. You got Bernie in the upper left corner. The reason he's in the upper left corner is because, well, I mean, he's mostly had a network of people who are very insular, who are tightly bundled around him and don't have any interest in being part of the Democratic establishment back at the middle there. You have Klobuchar off to the right. A lot of that is because her early campaign was really built around state-level operatives, particularly those who've operated in the upper Midwest, people who powered her victories in Minnesota, some key players from Iowa, but less of the kind of the national-level political professionals. And in the bottom, you have Bloomberg, perhaps no surprise there, late entrant to the race, former Republican mayor, businessman, very much outside of the Democratic mainstream to begin with, and also came in very late, so a lot of the talent he might have otherwise hired had already been snatched up by other candidates. That's changed a little bit as he's hired some people from some of the candidates who dropped out. But for now, that's kind of the state of the race as we see it from the big network perspective. But what does it actually mean, right? If some of our clients look at that, look at those big network maps and are like, that's just fascinating. I love all this data. Other clients are like, you know what, just get me to the actual insights. So won't judge you either way, depending where you come out there. But here's kind of a heat map of how we see the different candidates breaking out. And we'll go into each of these in greater detail, so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. I think the big thing for us as a takeaway here is that when we first started mapping their strengths across these respective parts of the Democratic bloc, what we found was there was huge disparities. At this point, most of those disparities have decreased. Each candidate, to be sure, has their own strengths and weaknesses, but for the most part, there's not a huge gap in kind of the capabilities and the relationships of one candidate with one sector versus another. Maybe the only exception to that is that Amy Klobuchar's campaign is still, from a pure network basis, probably less robust than some of her competitors. So let me jump into kind of walking through what each one of those different parts of the block looks like and how they've come up. And I'll just explain some of the key points here. But I think the one thing that jumps out for me kind of right out of the beginning of this is that, again, is everybody's competing for that block of Democratic establishment, campaign operatives, pollsters, consultants, et cetera. Elizabeth Warren, despite her kind of progressive reputation, actually went in quite early and hired up a number of Hillary alums, of others who kind of come from that Democratic establishment and seem to be doing that to really shore up some of her credentials. I would say her strongest early competition for those Hillary people was Kamala Harris. Now that Senator Harris has dropped out, some of those people have gone to various places, including to Bloomberg, some back to places like the DCCC, but Warren really made an early bid for that. When you look at the Obama alums, it's pretty evenly split between Vice President Biden and Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Obviously, different parts of the demographic there. Biden has a lot of the older and more experienced parts of that Obama machine. Buttigieg has more of the youngsters in that camp, but they're the two who've been the beneficiaries of that world. If you look at Sanders, he is very much outside that Democratic establishment for reasons I just discussed. Bloomberg as well. When you look at the Bloomberg campaign and the people he's brought on, they have been from a few key camps. They're people he worked with in the mayor's office. They're people he's worked with in industry, people he's worked with at his philanthropies, and to a lesser extent, some of the campaign operatives he's hired away from two candidates who dropped out, Kamala Harris as well as Steve Bullock. So when you're thinking about where he's building up some of his strength, it's probably from those two camps most notably. One side note here, and I think an interesting dynamic in this race, and again, something that I think people in this room, given the amount of time you've probably spent over the last couple of years engaged in state and local battles, is the extent to which Bloomberg and Buttigieg in particular are trying to leverage those connections they have at the local level to particular mayors who might come out and support them and point to their records of success at the local level. So for Mayor Pete, very early on, he locked up a lot of that support from mayors across the country. Mayor Bloomberg, in coming in, has also brought a lot of that power to bear, although for him, him. A lot of it comes from the mayors he worked with when he's been working on kind of what's the post-Paris response in the absence of the administration being involved in the Paris climate deal. The early states, what everybody's focusing on right now, less than a week to Iowa. How are they shaping up in this particular space? Well, in Iowa, if you just look at purely the strength of the campaign organizations, the three strongest that we've really pulled out are Warren, Sanders, and Klobuchar. Warren has probably the strongest overlap with the Iowa Democratic Party of any other candidate. Incidentally, also very strong with the Pennsylvania Democratic Party. Bernie's staff largely matches and mirrors his national level profile. That's to say he has a lot of activists from the progressive space. Two that we've highlighted here is local organizers from Planned Parenthood and League of United Latin American Citizens. Klobuchar, again, building a lot on those kind of deep upper Midwest roots, a lot of Minneapolis or Minnesota campaign operatives as well as longtime Iowa campaign operatives. If you look at New Hampshire, Bernie trying to pull off the victory he had there 4 years ago, doubling down with support from a lot of the local officials who supported his campaign then or supporting his campaign now. I think it's going to be a tougher road for him this time around in New Hampshire. And if you look at the ways that some of the other candidates have built inroads there, particularly Elizabeth Warren, who's coming from a neighboring state, it's going to be a far more contested space from our perspective as well. South Carolina, no doubt that Joe Biden is building up there, is trying to pull off his first big victory in that state, has gone out of his way to really try to leverage support from the African-American community in South Carolina. One key hire for him, he hired Michael McLean, who's a prominent South Carolina pastor, to sort of shore up his connections with the African-American community in South Carolina. One state I haven't mentioned here is Nevada. There's not a lot of differentiation between the top 6 teams in terms of the people they're hiring and the emphasis they're making on Nevada. The one exception to that is outside of our top 6, Tom Steyer has made an extensive bid on Nevada in terms of visits, in terms of the staff he's hiring there and the campaign he's building in that state. Super Tuesday, this is really the make or break for Michael Bloomberg. As folks are no doubt tracking, he's kind of foregone even competing in the first 4 states, but he's gone out and hired staff in 30 different states. He's got people all over the place. He's heavily invested in Super Tuesday. One of the things he's done, aside from hiring the staff from Kamala Harris's campaign and Steve Bullock's campaign, is he's paying his staffers just a lot more than any other candidate is. Money has a way of talking. Something like 25 to 30% more than your average campaign staffers are receiving. And as anybody who's worked on campaigns knows, it's a tough economic field to begin with. Let's flip to the next one. Progressive advocates. Again, I think this space is a little bit more complicated than it's been in previous years. Some of the mainstream organizations that have traditionally been part of the kind of progressive advocacy bloc of the Democratic Party, think, again, environmental groups like NRDC, think social justice groups like the NAACP, others of these groups that are the traditional progressive advocates are being careful, right? And there's not a ton of their staff who are jumping out to sort of declare their open support for specific campaigns. That's very, very different when you look at the highly progressive space, the grassroots organizers, the sort of far left, more social democratic type, or democratic socialist, type space. And when it comes to competing for those more progressive advocates, it's all ultimately really a race between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And I would say of those two, Sanders is clearly winning. Sanders has extraordinary amounts of support from environmentalists. It's not the kind of mainstream environmentalists necessarily like NRDC and others. It tends to be the far more progressive advocates like Greenpeace, like 350.org. Of course, he's got extensive support from the labor community, although probably not nearly as tight of a lock on the labor community as he did in previous years. But one thing I would say that's helping him when you're thinking about not just the support he has, but the kind of expertise they bring to the table, is he's got a number of young activists who have serious digital acumen. So people follow the Young Turks, very compelling media platform with some serious podcast power. You look at Now This, these viral videos we've all seen that all usually try to make Republicans look bad in some way or another. There are tons of people who've worked with these organizations that are connected back to Bernie and give him that same kind of digital reach and kind of the virality we see around Bernie's campaign online. Elizabeth Warren's campaign is less about those kind of grassroots progressive activists and more about the progressive academic intellectual types. Her two strongest supporters in this space and allied institutions are Demos, the social justice and economic reform think tank here in town, as well as the Roosevelt Institute, which has been at the forefront of a lot of the push on the left to break up big tech, break up big pharma, break up whatever big industry group there is out there. When we look at the other candidates, it's just the ties are not nearly as strong. One thing that is beginning to change, and I think as we get closer to the actual primaries and ultimately to the convention, is you are starting to see some activists who are aligning with specific campaigns. So Biden has more recently hired senior organizers from World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Working Group, Next Gen Climate, Tom Steyer's old group. He has longstanding ties to groups like, Campaign for Drug-Free Kids, things of that nature. So he's starting to try to build some connections in that space, perhaps in shoring up some of the criticism he's received from the left. Mayor Pete notably has hired some senior organizers from the American Federation of Teachers, seems to be tapping into both their credentials within the labor movement as well as their organizing prowess. Oops, let's see. All right, so talking about policy, I think this is where most of us, our minds tend to go, well, what does it actually mean for policy? Who's actually surrounding them? One interesting thing about this particular race is that I think for 4 of the 6, they not only have a cadre of longtime advisors around them that they're relying on, but they've actually kind of built and cultivated a brain trust over the course of many years. So let's talk about what that means. If you look at Biden, his strongest connections are into the national security and economic policy space. No surprise, given some of his portfolio in the Senate as well as in the White House. He's cultivated that over time by setting up the Biden Institute, setting up the Penn Biden Center, and these places which are sort of overflowing with experienced policy professionals who worked with the vice president when he's in government are now being tapped for his campaign as well. He's got connections to some other kind of mainstream organizations as well, like CSIS, Center for Equitable Growth. Again, think of like the establishment Democratic organizations. Elizabeth Warren, her connections are overwhelmingly into the academic space. She's surrounded by more academic, PhD, tenured professor types than any other candidate we've studied. Some of those are kind of pure academics. Some of those are academics who've moved over to places like the Roosevelt Institute, but that's really her power base and reflects her experience as an academic. For Mayor Bloomberg, ton of connections he's bringing over, particularly from Bloomberg Philanthropies. If you think about his policy advice, it's overwhelmingly from Bloomberg Philanthropies, and those are players who focused on environment and climate change, as well as public health. And he's brought those people into his campaign. Bernie, I think a lot of people were surprised by his power in 2016. He's doubled down on that and built up kind of a brain trust in that space by setting up things like the Sanders Institute, Our Revolution, but trying to find like-minded players and have them really develop what's a philosophy that's coherent and sort of spans across Bernie's electoral appeal. The two that are a little bit weaker in this space are Senator Klobuchar, who has a number of longtime Senate staff who are around her. She has some ties to some centrist Democratic groups like Center for American Progress, like CSIS, and then Mayor Pete, who has really tried to make up for any deficit he had in this space by hiring big. He got a couple of really good early hires, people who'd been in the Obama administration at the Department of Commerce, at the Domestic Policy Council, at the Office of Social Innovation. One thing that's really interesting about Mayor Pete's strategy, and I think it's reflected here on his policy advisors, but it's really reflected more broadly in how Mayor Pete has sort of surged into the top tier of candidates, is he's just maximized every single moment of his resume. He went to Harvard with a number of people who've gone on to prominent jobs in public policy, in Silicon Valley, in finance. He did a Rhodes Scholarship with similar groups of people, but even more elite and refined. He worked at McKinsey with people who've also gone on to finance and public policy and Silicon Valley type positions. He worked at the Cohen Group. That place is chock full of foreign policy advisors and gave him a lot of early credibility in that community, not to mention the fact that he's a Navy reservist. And then as mayor, he was not going to settle himself with purely being mayor of South Bend, but actually led organizations and got actively involved in mayors associations where he could build connections with a range of others. So whereas the conventional wisdom is that a candidate will want to establish their early credentials by going all in and building a formidable ground game, for Mayor Pete, it was really going to every single entry in his career and winning over the people in that space and using some of those elite connections to sort of validate him as a serious candidate. When we mapped his campaign network early on, his kind of hardcore political operative base was very weak. That's largely been erased at this point. So he has a strong ground game. He has great political consultants. He's built up the machinery of a traditional campaign. But it started with really relying on those personal connections he built throughout his very successful but fairly young career. Finally, talking about business. So this is perhaps, again, not the year to be a pro-business Democrat. Not exactly something that everybody's running on. And I think for the purpose of this conversation, we can exclude Senator Sanders and Senator Warren from this breakdown. Of course, they've got some ties to industry despite some of their rhetoric, but it's still not nearly as strong as these other candidates. Not surprisingly, if you look at Mayor Bloomberg, he overwhelmingly has the strongest number of total connections to the business community. These are people who've been his clients and colleagues from running the Bloomberg business, but also increasingly people he's brought over to serve on the board or otherwise be involved with Bloomberg philanthropies. We've called out a couple here. Kenneth Chenault, the CEO of American Express, Bob Iger, head of Disney. But these are guys he's really relied on through the years to build up not only his business empire, but also to support his very successful time in philanthropy. If we look at Vice President Biden, just the sheer amount of years that he's been on the stage means that the government affairs community in Washington is filled with Biden alums. A couple that we've called out that are most notable where some of his alums are placed are MGM Resorts, Apple, Herbalife. There are a range of kind of more centrist progressive organizations that I talked about in previous slides that are also alums of his, but a strong number of connections to the government affairs space there. Klobuchar, strong ties to law and industry on two different fronts. One, from her time as a lawyer, she's got a number of connections to corporate law. Lawyers are her single biggest fundraiser for her campaign. And then the high turnover she's had in her office for various reasons that I don't need to explain here. She's created a fairly extensive revolving door that's given her alums prominent positions in technology and pharma in the media world. Again, Mayor Pete, fairly young candidate and youngest serious candidate ever for president, but also has a lot of old friends and colleagues from the Rhodes Scholarship, from McKinsey, from the Cohen Group. This has been part of what's driven his just incredible fundraising numbers, as he's got a real lock on fundraising out of Silicon Valley and out of the financial services sector. A number of those are people he's known throughout his career. A number of those were top bundlers for President Obama that he's been able to leverage. One interesting thing we did is we looked at the overall the mega donors of the last cycle. That's to say, we identified the top 20 donors from the Democratic side of things and mapped them out against players. So, and a couple things that jumped out that was some were surprising and some were not so. Of course, no real connections from them to Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. The single biggest recipient of support from mega donors in this cycle is Michael Bennet, overwhelmingly. Cory Booker was a huge recipient of support from these players as well. And now I think it's a big question of kind of like where do all these players, these mega donors, actually align themselves at this point. Donald Sussman, who is the single biggest supporter of Cory Booker, is not openly declared, at least not as a last check, support for another candidate. He has gotten involved with a super PAC along with a former Republican donor to try to defeat President Trump, but it's not clear where he'll actually land. So, in the final analysis, what does all this mean? Well, it's tough to say. There are a lot of different ways we can take this. The early talent gaps, as I mentioned, are largely dissipated and all have solid ground games and bases of support. As I said, Klobuchar is probably the weakest end-to-end, but I don't want to make too much of that because, again, she is doing fairly well in the polls and secured kind of that second endorsement from the New York Times, among other accolades. But I do think that whoever comes out on top will say a lot about their strategy and about the networks around them. So if it becomes about progressive activism and grassroots organizing, that overwhelmingly favors Bernie. If it's about a traditional ground game backed up by big intellectual ideas, that falls strongly to Elizabeth Warren. If it's about centrist, kind of outsider ideas and the best ground game that money can buy, that goes to Mayor Bloomberg. If it goes to return to experienced, level-headed players, that's Biden. If it's kind of the fresh, pragmatic problem solvers, the Silicon Valley can-do types, the local change makers, kind of the younger and maybe less credentialed version of the Obama team, that goes to Mayor Pete. So a lot of different ways it could shake out. We have extensive research on all these people. It goes into the details of who's actually situated around them. But at this point, I'll stop and happy to take any questions that people have. And then after that, I don't want to be the only thing standing between you and Charlie Cook. So thank you all for coming out and listening, and happy to take a couple questions. I don't know if that's good or bad. All right. Well, I'll be at the back and available to chat with anybody who wants to talk further. I'm happy to talk about different ways we're doing this work and ways we can support you, and I'm also happy to answer questions about any of the research. But again, thanks everybody for your time. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you to Luke for that great presentation. We're now going to take a very brief break, so 10 minutes, and then once everyone comes back, Charlie will be on stage. So 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed a cookie. I know it's early for that, but they actually were pretty good. So if you didn't get one on your way out. I don't think Charlie needs much introduction. This is, Charlie has like playoff season, but his playoffs like this go a whole year. So Charlie's probably been in his playoffs since the end of last year, and it's going to go until probably December with the wrap-ups of the election. So I'm glad we can get him early, and we'll get him often throughout the year. But excited to hear Charlie's insights today. So without making you all wait for Charlie any longer, Charlie Cook.
Thanks, Kevin. You know, I look around this room, and there's so many people that I know, and so many people that I've seen at some of these, you know, in the last year or so. So I'm trying to say, okay, now what can I leave out that you've already heard? But then again, there's some that hadn't. And so what I'm going to do is sort of try to hit lightly some things that I've done at several of these before, but do enough where you're aware of them, but not make you really bored with it. I'm first just off the top, and when you're talking to your clients, members, partners, bosses, whatever, and people that don't care anything at all about politics, well, first thing that's not controversial at all is if we don't see a record high turnout in November, we're not going to miss it by much. And just if you're curious, the record high is a 65% of the eligible voters voting. And we hit that in 1940 and 1960. We were at 60% in 2016. So this would be a big jump. But, why? And it gets into the substance of what we're talking about. You go back to 2014, the previous midterm election. Lowest midterm election turnout since 1942, And then we have the 2016 election, and the turnout's average. It was basically in line with the 3-4 previous one at 60. No big deal. And then 2018 comes along, and we have the highest turnout since 1914. Now, when you think about that for a second, when you go from the lowest in 72 years to the highest in 104 years, that doesn't happen accidentally. Something's going on. Somebody's pumped up, energized, mad, something, or all the above. Something's going on. And the thing is, it's at both ends. I mean, they are, okay, let me get left, right. They're the people that love President Trump. They either love him personally, they love the policies, they like and then there's the people that loathe him. And all of them are incredibly motivated right now. And the interesting thing is the summer of 2018, Democrats were incredibly motivated. They were still ticked off from November 2016. Talk about partisans coming home. Well, Democrats never left home. I mean, they'd been on fire ever since. But Republicans, when you ask how interested in the election, it was like this. I mean, there was a big gap between the two sides. And Republicans were really worried about, okay, wait, how do we get our people jacked up? Because, the House and all this. And the Kavanaugh nomination fixed it for Republicans. Now, the line I use is, it was a color enhancement event. It made the blues bluer and the reds redder. But there's one catch. Since Democrats, their motivation levels were like 9.5, they didn't have much room to move up. I mean, they were already at a highly agitated place, but Republicans weren't. And the level of energy focus on the election basically leveled out as a result of the Kavanaugh, but it's both sides. But I think we're going to have sort of that in this election. And if, impeachment may do a tiny bit, but I think this was going to happen. This was going to happen anyway. And, there's always sort of a danger of projecting something that's 8 or 9 months away, well, this is going to be the most important thing in the history of the planet and stuff. But things 8 or 9 months out usually aren't. But I'll get into the impeachment stuff stuff later on. But why this interest? Part of it is, when was the last time, we all used to hear people say, wow, gosh, it doesn't matter who wins the presidency. When was the last time you heard that? It's been, at least 3 years since I've seen that. And that doesn't tell you, somebody saying that doesn't tell you anything about which side they're on. It's just a matter of fact. But the second thing has to do with that thing was so close. When you think about it, Saturday afternoon, turn on the TV set, and there's a college football game or a college basketball game, and it's two teams that I have no connection with whatsoever. But if it's like tied, if it's a 1-point game, you kind of, hey, that's you might linger there, even though you really don't care about either team. It gets you excited. And then there's the surprise ending. That was, now, anybody here, raise your hand if you went to the University of Michigan. Raise your hand if you went to Michigan State. Oh, well, I'm wasting everybody's time. No, I was at the Michigan State game where University of Michigan was ahead every second that there was time on the clock until a fumble when there was less than a second left. State won. You'd never seen 110,000 people as quiet and saying something about what it was what just happened, But so it matters. It's, wow, close, 78,000 votes out of 137 million, and then surprise ending. Look, there are a bunch of people that say, well, I knew he was going to win. And, I'm tempted, sometimes I think snarky things, but I don't say them. And that was the difference between my competitor and good friend Stu Rothenberg and I, that Stu's from New York, I'm from Louisiana. Stu would say it. I would wish I had the guts to say it, but say, you know what, if you knew that Trump was going to win, it'd have been terrific if you had called him or called the campaign, because they didn't know. That you clearly were smarter than they were, or the other side. Because, anyway, so there's a surprise element of it. And then, the whole things, don't worry, I'm going to get on the handicapping very, very, very shortly. But the whole thing about, whether the polls were wrong, and that is such an urban legend. Yes, there were some wrong, but they weren't as wrong as people think. And, we had gone from 1888 up until 2000 and we had had a lot of close elections. But we never had an inversion during that period, after 1888 until 2000, with the popular vote going one way, electoral college the other. And I think a lot of us got kind of sloppy going into 2000, and then the lesson didn't stick particularly well for 2016. But when you think about, 1948, Truman Dewey, boy, that was close. 1960, Kennedy Nixon, that was close. 1968, Nixon Humphrey George Wallace, that was close. 76, Carter Ford. 92, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Ross Perot. We'd had really close, but they all went the same way. And then 2000 happens, we go, wow, that was weird. I forgot that this could happen, And then we thought, well, it was just kind of a weird thing, and proceed. And then get to 2016, and holy mackerel, so you will see. Now, but in terms of the polls, national polls, and a bunch of you have heard me say this, so I shouldn't really be wasting time on this, but would the national polls show, going into Election Day, real clear politics, Hillary Clinton was ahead by 3 points. What do national polls measure? Theoretically, the national popular vote. What happened to the national popular vote? She won by 2.1 percentage points, 2.9 million votes. So now, 0.9 of a point off. Yeah, that was off. Dirty little secret, that's as close as this stuff gets. That was actually closer than they had been back in 2012 when the national polls were showing Obama-Romney closer than the 3-point margin ended up being. But the thing is, have it close, and that 3 points, well, that's always, that's always been plenty enough to, to win. But so the national stuff really wasn't off by much. But the other thing is, when the pollsters went back and looked at where were 0.9 of a point isn't much, but where did it go wrong? One of the things they found was ever so slight undersampling of whites. Small undersampling of whites without a 4-year college degree. And then you have small town, rural. Any of you from Pennsylvania, we've got Philadelphia Carville used to say Philadelphia in the east, Pittsburgh in the west, and Alabama in between. Well, Alabama showed up in 2016 in margin, and a lot of other small town rural. So, that was off. But where you did have some polls that were off, that were seriously off, were in particularly Michigan and Wisconsin. And part of it was neither of those states were expected to be particularly close. And so there weren't a lot of national outfits polling. And, I think what you're going to see is when you have the major networks and Fox and CNN both do a lot of state polling, in big years, and you'll see NBC, Marist will do a bunch, and ABC Post will do some. Watch those really carefully, because those polls typically are a little bit more professional than Professor Schwartz out at Tech. And the other thing about some of the local polling is they tend to stop polling, week, 10 days out before the election, and they take their time about reporting. So anything that happened late in the campaign, didn't get caught. So the state stuff, they were off, but 40-something states went exactly the way we thought. 42, 43, 4 or 5 states we knew were too close, and 3 states really shocked the hell out of us. But just on that point about the state stuff being off, in Michigan, in the last 3 months before the election, Hillary Clinton had led in 25 out of the 26 statewide polls that were public in the last 3 months before the election. 25 out of 26. Now, for a state that had gone Democratic 6 times in a row, Michael Dukakis was the last Democrat to lose that state. What the hell is Charlie Cook expecting to think, going to expect going into this? And of course, we had the Clinton campaign in their infinite wisdom, choosing not to do any individual state polling in the last 3 weeks. So normally, if somebody sees something and they hit the panic button, you can kind of figure out, they must have seen something interesting. But in Pennsylvania, 37 out of 38, Wisconsin, all 32 public polls had Clinton ahead. So you can bet the national organizations are going to be doing a heck of a lot more polling in individual states. Now, I don't know who's going to win this election. It's going to be close. It's going to be really, really close. And we all know that real close elections can go either way, and you could have tiny little things tip it one way or other, things you might not have guessed, and that this election may well turn on events that haven't even happened yet. So, all the normal disclaimers. But what I find so interesting is when I travel around the country and, I go to New York and see, all these really smart Wall Street people, or I did actually a cool investment banking speech in Hong Kong last week, which was really if you didn't think I was ADD before, you know it now. I land in Hong Kong, nonstop from San Francisco. I see all kinds of Chinese health officials all over the place, and they got their little, fever guns and stuff. And over the course of the week, the first full day I was there, on any given day, 2 or 3% of Chinese people be wearing a mask. I mean, go figure. It was about 10 or 15% on Monday, and it just gradually. By Thursday, the last full day I was there, you walk down any street, downtown Hong Kong, 65% had masks on. I mean, we're there. So anyway, Friday morning, get on an airplane, fly back, land in San Francisco, never saw a single person that appeared to be in any health-related area whatsoever. Not a fever gun, nothing. So I felt safe. But anyway, okay. But the point of all that, boy, I got off subject on that one. The point of all that was there are a lot of people that seem to know who's going to win this, and more of them tend to be on the Trump's going to win side. And the thing is, look, I can think of a dozen scenarios that he gets reelected. I mean, I can think of plenty. I mean, hell, one of them might be, say, the election becomes a referendum on impeachment instead of a referendum on Donald Trump, which would be a very hard thing for him to win. Ooh, that's a little different. So there are plenty of scenarios that he can win. But the thing is, most of the assumptions that people who are, and this is true around the world, that's why I get that you talk to investment people, literally in every major continent, and most of them think, in fact, I've seen surveys of major money managers, 65, 70, 75. Somebody was telling me about 80, 85. I kind of doubt that anything would show that. But anyway, huge majorities. But when you talk to people that, and this is sort of why I wanted to organize it this way, why are you so sure that President Trump is going to get reelected? And the arguments tend to go down into four areas. Number one, elected incumbent presidents usually get reelected, and that's true. The second is a strong economy. Incumbents win if the economy's strong. Third is that, he doesn't need to win the popular vote. All he needs to do is win the Electoral College. And the fourth is, he proved the pundits and the polls were all wrong, and I kind of talked about this a minute ago, so, we shouldn't listen to them. Anyway, now let's take each of these real quick. Incumbent presidents usually win. Absolutely. We've had 8 since the end of World War II, 6 out of 8 won. Political scientists tell us it's about 2.5, 3-point advantage, all other things being equal, that incumbent gets a boost. Now, I'm not sure when all things have ever been equal and how they figured that out, but, okay, fine, but think about a couple of tiny little factoids, and you've heard all these things, but let's put them in one place. First president, the history of polling, let's just call it 1948, right after World War II. Although actually Churchill was looking at polls during World War II, which I thought fascinating. I read a new biography of him recently, and it's like, wow, Gallup was doing stuff in Great Britain. Great biography by Andrew Roberts just came out. Anyway, number one, first president in the history of polling to never have a 50% approval rate. First. Second, and this is a little statistic that I love, it's how long, presidents get honeymoons. You come in and, there's a reservoir of goodwill. There are people that say, I didn't vote for the person, but, I want the country to do well, and he or she hadn't screwed up yet, so give them the benefit of the doubt until they, step in a pile of you-know-what or something, fine. And the best, but they get a honeymoon. And the best example of that was, think about George W. Bush winning in 2000. Man, that's the toughest set of circumstances you can find. You lose the popular vote. The election gets, it's a contested vote in one state in Florida. It goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But you know what his first job approval rating was, like a couple weeks, 2 weeks after taking office? 57%. So there were people that never voted for the guy. They didn't vote for the guy, but they were willing to at least initially give him the benefit of the doubt. And the thing is, what normally happens is presidents start up here, and the honeymoon ends as it, I'm looking around to see if my wife's friends are here. Of course, ours never ended, 37 years ago. But anyway, so it's coming down. And then events. Good things happen, your numbers go back up. Bad things happen, your numbers go down. It kind of oscillates back and forth. That's just all pretty logical. But for President Trump, there have been 394 major national polls measure his job approval rate. 394. And in 393 out of 394, his numbers were upside down, or underwater, as pollsters say. The only one was the very first Fox poll from February of 2017. Now, let me say this. Fox, you can love them, you can hate them, but their poll is actually a very, very, very good poll. In fact, I like their poll better than CBS lately. But anyway, I shouldn't do that. Anyway, but their first poll had Trump approval at 48, disapproval at 47, and then each of the 36 or so subsequent Fox polls, he's been out underwater, and then every one of everybody else's. So obviously, no president's ever even remotely had that. And then the third one is, well, as a message of honeymoons ending and disapprovals going up, it's how long does it take a president before their Gallup disapproval hits 50%? You get a 50% disapproval. And George W. Bush, 1,205 days. His dad, 1,136 days. President Reagan, here, our building we're in, 690 days. Barack Obama, 572. Bill Clinton, 150. And President Trump, 8 days. And that's not intended to be funny, but it's just like, you know what? The guy didn't get a honeymoon. I mean, that's not a punchline. That's just a very, very simple fact. And that normally, in their first 3 years, presidents have about a 20-25 point trading range, if you will, between their highest job approval rating and their lowest job approval rating. 20-25 points is normal. But for President Trump, in Gallup, for example, highest Gallup job approval rating President Trump's gotten is 46%, 46. Lowest, 35. So he's got only an 11-point trading range. Okay, Fox News, highest job approval rating he's got was 48, lowest, 38. CNN also had a 10-point trading range, which is exactly the same margin. Numbers were a digit or two off, but the margin was exactly the same at 10 points. And, you know, ABC Washington Post and NBC Wall Street Journal and the PBS NPR Marist poll all had, 8 or 9 point trade. So it's like the numbers, they don't. And the weirdest thing is, no matter what happens, good or bad, his numbers move very, very little, if any at all. I mean, the lack of elasticity in his numbers is really pretty remarkable. I mean, it's like his approval numbers. I mean, yes, they're low, but the main thing is they seem impervious to any news, good or bad. I mean, lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, and his numbers barely went up. What a lot of people would say are shocking, scandalous allegations that some of them would appear to be backed up. His numbers don't go down much. And the fascinating thing to me is that if you looked at everybody that approves of President Trump right now, virtually every single one of them approved his job first week in office. And you look at almost everybody that disapproves of him, same thing. They hadn't moved. And so this expecting, and I have, let's see, where is that? Oh, and for a while, I haven't heard it lately, but back over the summer, when summer, post-Mueller, and then we get into Ukraine and stuff. And I would have people say, when are President Trump's approval numbers, when are they going to drop? And I'm sort of thinking, for something to drop, they kind of have to rise first. And that expecting his numbers to rise, it's kind of like expecting pre-shrunk jeans to shrink. They're not going to. They're there. It's just sort of, it's there. So, and the other thing is that, you consistently have 85-90% of Republicans approve. And that number just doesn't move much. And then you look over on the Democratic side, and it's usually 5 to 9% approve. And that number doesn't move much. And it's only among independents where it's usually, in the 30s, it kind of moves a little bit, but there's just no elasticity there. And so with this pattern that's out there, this presumption, incumbents usually wins, and he's an incumbent, therefore, maybe he does. I mean, you could argue 50-50 chance he does, but I tell you what, just because incumbents generally win, that's not a terribly compelling argument. Then you get to the economy. And, when I was a kid and taking civics class, we learned that Americans vote their pocketbooks. Now, there's sort of two different interpretations of that. One is people voted their self-interest. What's good for me? And the other was their personal feelings about their personal finances, the country. Are they feeling optimistic? Are they feeling pessimistic? That sort of thing. And remember 1992, one of the most famous sayings in all of politics was that great philosopher James Carville, with the whiteboard that says it's the economy, stupid. And the thing is, it was absolutely true in 1992. But you know what? It's not very true anymore. And in one of the best books about the 2016 election, is a one called Identity Crisis. It's by three political scientists, Lynn Vavreck, John Sides, and Michael Tesler. Actually, let me do it this way. It was written by three political scientists, but it is in English and easy to understand. My lips didn't get chapped or anything, and great book. But the thing that was just really, really, it was all about, identity and, working class whites and upscale college educated suburban women and all this kind of stuff. But actually, towards the front, they found that the University of Michigan started doing their index of consumer sentiment, how people feel about the economy, back in the early 60s. And the other one, the Conference Board does one, and then there are a few others, but those are sort of the two big ones. But what they found was from President Kennedy's administration all the way through George W. Bush's administration, there was a really, really, really strong relationship between consumer confidence and a president's approval rating. And we know that presidential approval ratings are pretty good predictors of how an incumbent president's going to do. But the thing about it is, and it's just logical, if people are feeling better about the economy, if people think that their personal finances are getting better, they're more like, they would historically, they would feel a little bit better about the president. And the other opposite, they'd feel worse or whatever. So it was true for all that time. And then it stopped. It stopped when early in the Obama presidency, and it did not restart under President Trump. And you think about it, and I've got I think there's two arguments for why. One is that, we've gotten into tribal politics. Who's in our tribe, who's in the other tribe. We're voting culture, and I'll get into this more in a couple minutes, but, people that live in small town, whites that live in small town rural America tend to do this, and college educated white women who live in the suburbs tend to go this. And it's stuff about some of this has nothing to do with the economy. So some of it's just identity and tribalism. But the other part is how we see the economy is now seen through a partisan lens, which is kind of mind-boggling. But although actually I saw an article recently that talked about how people perceive the weather is linked to, not whether it's going to rain tomorrow, but kind of gets into something called climate change that nobody talks about. But anyway, I'm teasing. But let me exaggerate slightly, but basically this is really true. Obama comes in, and the economy, we were in a recession, we'd had the financial crisis, the economy was awful. And he gets in, and the economy starts getting better, but wow. It's just real gradual. And the U.S. economy is not at a place that anybody would want, which is why a year out from his reelection, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether President Obama was going to get reelected. But the economy, it was getting better, but not real fast and not real much. Now, people that are Democrats would look at that economy and they would tell pollsters, the economy is getting better. President Obama is trying his best. Republicans drove the truck off into a ditch and we're having to, get a tow truck and pull it out. And it's getting better, but it's not where we want it to be. But the thing is, they looked at the economy and saw that the glass was half full. Republicans would look at the same economy at the same time, and they would say, the economy sucks. And you know what? Fundamentally, for a long, it did suck. Now, they kind of forget sort of whose watch it began to suck on. But anyway, but the thing about it is they looked at the glass and they saw it, water barely covering the bottom. So it was a total partisan lens on how they view the economy. And let me give you two kind of examples of how this sort of culture stuff or what would be the economy ought to work. And a bunch of you actually heard me use this example, but I just sort of like this one so much. I was speaking to an ag group meeting, and I was talking to this beef cattle rancher who is from someplace in North Florida, along the Alabama-Georgia border. So like not Florida. Anyway, and I was asking him, are you worried about tariffs? And he said, oh yeah, I'm really worried about tariffs. And the very next thing out of the man's mouth was, but I think everything the president's doing is what he believes is in the national interest, and I support him 100%. So let's just say this guy probably wasn't voting his economic self-interest, okay? I mean, and another example, my wife. We've done well. We've done well the last few years. We benefited from the tax cuts. Economically speaking, hell, we ought to be happy as clams. President Trump could find a cure for both cancer and the common cold. He could ensure peace for the planet for eternity. He could prosperity for eternity. And my wife and a lot of other college-educated suburban white women would never vote for him in a million years, and she would have a great moral crisis about whether she could vote right now with anybody wearing the same colored jersey that he wears. Man, that has nothing to do with the economy. So you sort of look at this, wow, gosh, this is a new world order. So this economy thing, it's important. Now, I'm not saying that the economy, economy has gotten, and his numbers went up a tiny bit. But, and here's an example, actually, a good example. Approve, disapprove on handling the economy. Approve, disapprove on overall job. I'm going to do Fox and ABC Post. Fox News, handling the economy. 56% of, I can't remember if it's voters or Americans, but I don't think there'd be much of a difference on this. 56% approve the job President Trump is doing handling the economy, 56%. 38% were disapprove. So, approve overall, 45 approve, 54 disapprove. So there's like a 12, and it's like, so it's not like people don't know the economy's good. They're willing to say, yeah, the economy's good. You know what? He hadn't been bad there. But that's not how I'm basing my big decision. And ABC Post, actually numbers were almost, actually the handling economy was identical, 56-38, and their overall 44 approve, 51 disapprove. So it was a 12-point gap again. So you just look at that and go, wow, this isn't the economy. This isn't the economy right now. And that not in the book, I don't think. I didn't remember seeing it in the book, but in an email exchange, and I've actually read other places where the two of the authors from that book said that given, if you look at where the economy is and where it's been, that President Trump's job approval ratings ought to be 15 points higher. So in other words, instead of say 45, he ought to be bumping up against 60. And wow, that's kind of interesting. And sort of kind of related to it, there's a terrific professor at Harvard, a political scientist, Steve Ensilaba here. It's Basque name, if you're curious. Real smart guy. But anyway, he says if you look at people's attitudes towards President Trump and attitudes towards his policies, that his policies tend to poll 10 points ahead of him. Now, when you put those things together, I think you have something called the Trump penalty. It's what is he not getting that theoretically he ought to be getting. So this economy thing, I'd be careful about jumping too far into that. And the other thing is just sort of alignment. Don't worry, we can get the Democrats very shortly. Is just the realignment. We're seeing big realignments that are moving things a lot more than tradition. And I touched on these already. Urban areas have been Democrats since Moby Dick was a guppy. Suburban areas used to be Republican. Then they moved swing, and now they're starting to move pretty aggressively towards Democrats. And you noticed in the 2018 midterm elections, where did Democrats pick up the majority? Where did they get their 40 seats? They won traditionally Republican seats, in some cases really long-held Republican seats outside of places like Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Kansas City, Oklahoma City, Richmond. And I left out like the North, but it was suburban. It's like, wow, that's so geography, and with small town rural America, and you think, boy, back in the Roosevelt, the New Deal and rural electrification and all this, that most of those people used to be Democrats, and now for whites living in small town rural America, man, it's like a no-fly zone for Democrats. I mean, Earl Pomeroy. Yeah, we had somebody that experienced that up close and personal. Anyway, okay. Education, it used to be lower, the lower your educational level, the more likely you're going to be a Democrat. You have a whole bunch of education and, you probably made more money and all that. You were a Republican. Well, that's changing now. We're seeing a realignment. With these two things together, what we're seeing is working class whites, and whites, if you want to define it, whites with less than a 4-year college degree, they are moving out of the Democratic Party at an amazing speed. And those folks, non-college whites, they started leaving the Democratic Party a little bit in the 80s, the Reagan years, but mostly more in the 90s and the Gingrich Revolution election in 94. And so they started moving, and then outside the South, it started a little bit more recently. But boy, so that it's just going real strong towards Republicans, while those white suburban going the other way. So we're seeing this weird alignment that doesn't look much at all like things that used to look. Real quick, religion among whites. Religion, if you're a white evangelical Christian, if you vote Democrat, wow, that's interesting. That's interesting. Or a conservative Catholic. And if you don't go to church, or let's say you worship at the Our Church of the Sunday New York Times, or Our Lady of the CBS Sunday Morning, or whatever, you know what? You're more likely going to be voting Democrat. So the religion thing, we talked about, gender is pretty obvious. And so, anyway, you get all that. Okay, so get more political. President Trump doesn't need to win the popular vote. You're right. That's absolutely true, as we know. And I mentioned about we've had closer races, and they all went the same way. That's fine. And we can skip all of that. Inversion. Well, hell, I already talked about that. One statistic that, in the last election, the wrinkle, Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1 percentage points, 2.9 million votes, but lost the Electoral College. Remember, where Trump got 306. And we all know that it's because Republican votes are just more efficiently allocated. I mean, that Democrats run up the score in California and Illinois and New York State, and once you win a state by one vote, every vote you get above that is wasted. So if you win California by 4 million votes, you've just wasted 3,999,999. So you get the joke. And then there are these some other states that where if we didn't have a former member of the North Dakota delegation, I would say there are more cows than people, but every one of them have 3 electoral votes, and the vast majority of those, we know where they're going, the North Dakotas, South Dakotas, Wyomings, you get the general idea. So that the Electoral College is sort of loaded up this way, and while Democrats can run up the score, but the point is, some of the really good numbers crunchers, and David Wasserman in our shop, and there's a guy at the New York Times, Nate Cohen, in the Upshot team, they're just kind of putting what they're saying together. You could see Democrats win the national popular vote by as much as 3 or 4 percentage points compared to the 2.1 last time, or win the national popular vote by as many as 5 million votes, and could conceivably lose the Electoral College. So that it may be more out of whack this coming time than last time, because there's a pretty decent chance that whoever's the Democratic nominee, based on trends and things in California, they're going to win California by a bigger margin than Hillary Clinton did. And same thing in New York State, Illinois, pretty fair chance of that. And meanwhile, the states that Republicans win by big margins, President Trump's probably going to win Texas again, but he's not going to waste a whole lot of votes. It's going to be a very efficient win, So that, means we have to watch the states, much more closely. And I'd already talked about those 3 states, so we can skip that. And then finally, I already talked about that. So let's get down to Democrats. The main event here. All the people, I know who's going to win all this. And there's an old joke about a woman was asked by a friend, "How's your husband?" And she replied, "Compared to what?" And the thing about it is, how's President Trump going to do? Well, compared to who? I mean, I just kind of think that's a little germane, And so just a couple, first of all, observations, and then get into the real handicapping. Just if you lost track. We've had 28 Democratic presidential candidates. 12 are still here, and 16 have dropped out. And remember, in 2016, we thought it was like mind-boggling that Republicans had 17, and here, we had Democrats up to 28. But the thing about it is, it's not just an anomaly. I think it really affects the race in several ways. That I think you had a heck of a lot of people, Democrats, that looked at the debate as stretched over 2 nights with 10 apiece or what. You know what? I'm not going to waste my time on this. When it gets down to the last 5 or 6 people, I'll start paying attention then. I mean, and remember in the book Future Choice, Alvin Toffler talked about overchoice. Where sometimes people have so many choices that they effectively choose not to choose. I mean, it's a lot easier. You want a scoop of ice cream. It's kind of easier to go into a place that has chocolate and vanilla than if you go into Baskin Robbins with 31 flavors. And at least half of them I like. So, anyway, too many, and it froze people. But the other thing is, and my colleague, Amy Walter, we were both sort of thinking and talking about this, but she put it on a much better level. Think about the very beginning of this campaign. Who was at the top? Let's just do national, because things hadn't really started in Iowa, New Hampshire. I was looking at the clock. Oh, shit. Who was at the top of the polls early on? Well, it was Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, right? And if you looked at the national polls right now, who's at the top? Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Well, interesting. Now, along the way, things kind of moved around, and, Warren had a surge and Buttigieg. I mean, you had lots of things in between. But Amy's point was that the common denominator between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and other than being older white men who have been in Congress a long time and Democrats, there's not a lot in common other than those things, but they were brands. They had identities. And in all of this din of all these voices, and where people didn't know one from another, and that the 2 brands were there. And early on in polling, it was interesting. You look at Joe Biden's support, and when pollsters would ask, "Who's your second choice?" the second choice was usually Bernie Sanders. And for Bernie people, early on, the second choice was Joe Biden. Now, a lot of cases, the only other one they knew, but people had an idea who these people were, and the rest of them was just sort of a jumbled mess. And as a result, you could have really capable people who could make great presidents. Michael Bennett. Wow, what a serious, smart guy. The country could do a lot worse. And, if he jumped in the pond, it wouldn't cause a ripple. I mean, it just is, it's like he was never born in this race. And a bunch of others, and I'm not knocking him, I like him, but this has affected the race and created distortions. Now, we have seen a party realignment, and a lot of people say, well, the Democratic Party is a lot more liberal than it used to be, which, compared to Bill Clinton's era, absolutely, Democratic Party is more liberal. Why is it more liberal? Have a lot of Democrats just sort of become more liberal? I'm sure there's some. But I think what really happened was this. When you had those working class whites, the whites with less college degree, small town, rural, when they left the Democratic Party, they had been the least liberal people in the Democratic Party. Now, if you have a party, a left of center party, and you take out the least liberal people, what's going to happen? Well, the center of gravity is going to move over to the left. Now, the question is, and this has been something that's been happening for a while. Now, the question is, with these college-educated, suburban, particularly women, that now that they're moving the opposite direction, is there a suburban offset? How much of that is offset? We don't know, because this is newer than that. So, real good question about sort of who is the Democratic Party. The second thing is, Democrats come in all shapes and sizes, but the one thing that unifies all Democrats, they all hate President Trump. Now, having moved to this town when President Nixon was starting his re-election campaign in '72, I thought that it kind of appeared that Democrats kind of hated Nixon. I tell you what, if somehow he came back to life and took office, I think Democrats would give President Nixon a ticker-tape parade right now. I mean, that'd be a trade-off they'd do in a second. I mean, but the thing is, we've on the Republican side, they seem to hate Bill Clinton more than they hated any previous Democratic president. And then President Obama comes along and goes to a whole new level. And, Democrats towards George W. After the Florida challenge, they kind of went down. And then '06 and the war went way back up. So this is the unifying thing in the party. And as a result, a word that you rarely heard in a discussion about presidential nomination politics before, electability, suddenly this thing that's like a nothing burger most of the time, it's become really, really important. Now, it's important to say, and I've run out of time, so I'm supposed to go to the Q&A, but I'm going to stick in like 2 more points, okay? That you can divide up the Democratic Party into 2 groups. And you can divide it all the ways and left, right, and all this, but basically one group is over, 60%. They want to beat President Trump. That they don't actually care who wins the Democratic nomination. I'm exaggerating, but it's get him out. Just get him out. And they want to hit the reset button. Amy calls them restorationists. They want to restore things to where it was before Donald Trump took office. 60%. Then you got 40% over here. Now, they dislike, hate, whatever, President Trump just as much as that group. But they think wait a minute, that's just, you do that first, and then this other stuff is really important. And, you go to a Sanders or a Elizabeth Warren, and man, I tell you what, you listen to it, I'm not being judgmental, but you look at it, it's a lot different than going back in '88 to a Michael Dukakis event, or '84, a Mondale, or '80, Ted Kennedy. I mean, we've all seen plenty of traditional Democratic liberals and pretty liberal, but this is this weird blending of populist And nobody ever accused Michael Dukakis of being a populist, or John Kerry, but this is almost more of a Huey Long. So it's liberal, but it's populism, and basically it blows. I don't want to say, I'm trying to avoid the term revolutionary. Fundamental change. So 40% fundamental change. Economic system, political system. Fire all, Warren, one of her major tenets is to ban lobbying. Big, which the Democrats, you haven't heard Joe Biden do that really, and a lot of these others. So restoration versus fundamental change, or fundamental versus incremental change. And it's two completely different mindsets, but this side is predicating on get the guy out. Doesn't matter, who it is secondary to getting him out to begin with. So that's what's sort of driven the electability thing more than anything else. Now, the traditional view of electability has most people ideology. Who can go after swing voters, and who can grab a disproportionate share of the voters between the 40-yard lines, between the 30-yard lines. That's a pretty big deal. And now there are a lot of other, Sanders, Warren supporters, a lot of them just kind of say, they just don't buy electability. But some of them, they do. But their definition of electability is really different. It's if you can't get a strong vote out of the base, how electable are you? How many swing voters can you get that will matter if your base isn't coming out? Which is that's a legitimate argument. But because of the antipathy towards President Trump, it's actually gotten larger than that. Because you have people that normally would like to do certain things that are becoming risk averse because to them, and I'm talking about the 60% over here, the importance to them of getting President Trump out is so great that, you find, I know of some polling and focus groups for Democrats that found in early states women Democrats that voted for Hillary Clinton, women Democrats who desperately want a woman president, but some of them are having some hesitation. You know what? I'd love it, but maybe there are some people that won't vote, and this time we may need to push off for another 4 years, which is like, wow. That's really, to be honest, when I heard this Democratic pollster telling me about this, I was kind of surprised. Then I asked a few others, and it's like, well, yeah. Race. Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, two really great talented, Julian Castro, telling me, man, they just didn't scratch the surface. And the thing is, you can't say, well, it's because they were minority. Well, because we just elected Barack Obama back in 2008. But is this election different? Is it different? And remember back in August of 2008 when John McCain was doing a televised town hall, and a woman said, they're doing the Q&A, and a woman said, I can't trust Obama, he's an Arab. And you remember what John McCain did? He said, he interrupted her, said, ma'am, there's a lot that I disagree with Barack Obama on, but he is a decent family man. He is an American, okay? Which I thought was like a hell of a stand-up thing to do and to say. Now, not being partisan in any way, but raise your hand if you think President Trump would do that. That the rules of play, the rules of the game may be a little different this year, so that Obama managed to do it, but maybe this, maybe we can defer 4 years because this one's too important. And the thing about it is, I tend to think, take Pete Buttigieg and orientation. There's a slice of the African American community that, for religious, cultural reasons, have a problem with gays. Just, it's not all, it's not half. I don't even think it's a third, but it's a slice over there. Other than them, you show me somebody that will never vote for a gay candidate, and I'll show you somebody that hadn't voted Democrat for president in a good while. They didn't vote for Hillary. not that orientation had anything to do with anything. They didn't vote for John Kerry. They didn't vote. No. Those kind of people kind of left the Democratic Party, and there's a value structure within the Democratic Party that, for the most part, just that's not so. But it's wow. This is new territory. We ought to do this. We ought to do this before too long. Maybe not this time. But the interesting thing is, you look at the whole list of 12 candidates or 28, and you could disqualify every single one of them. Pete Buttigieg is too young. Well, but Biden and Sanders and Bloomberg, they're too old. You could come up with a reason that may or may not have any legitimacy at all that disqualifies the whole thing. But people are putting more weight on some than on others. But this has had, and now, and finally, Trump, okay, handicapping. Iowa, New Hampshire, as you all know, we've had 4 different candidates in first place in Iowa in the last 3 months. We've had 4 different candidates that were in first place in New Hampshire last 4 months. The gap between number 1 and number 4 is amazingly close, and it's all been kind of back and forth. But right now, Bernie Sanders at the top at both. So Bernie Sanders is ahead in Iowa. He is ahead in New Hampshire. New Hampshire more. But the thing about it is, and he is the best financed of the Democrats competing in the early states. As the word we used a little while ago, durable, So is there a pretty good chance that Bernie comes in first, but if not first, second? Oh, I'd say there's a pretty good chance of that. Joe Biden, we don't know. He's in the mix, and it's not a wide margin. Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, who kind of went up to first. The thing is, so it's tight. Look, anybody can win these, but you see patterns, and where Bernie's doing pretty well in both these early states, and he's already the one that's raising the most money of those. So you say, well, there's a real chance. If you were just going to say, just looking objectively at the 4 and say, well, who would seem to have the best chance of winning the Democratic nomination of those 4, or throw Klobuchar in for 5, you can make a pretty good case that would be Bernie Sanders. Now, but then you get into the electability stuff. And will electability, is it more important or less important in Iowa, less important in New Hampshire? What about when you get to Nevada, South Carolina? All these things. But I've been on a kick, and I wrote a column earlier this week on Bloomberg, but unfortunately I wrote it 3 times longer than the space was for National Journal Daily, and my editor is terrific, but and always does a great job. But I read it, was like, crap, this isn't a good, my thinking is a little bit more engaged, is better than that, but it is what it is. But anyway, I was going to say, but I've been on this Bloomberg kick for a while, not because I met him once in my life and it was like 10 years or so ago, but I think there's a 40 to 50% chance that Joe Biden is going to win the nomination. Nationally, he's a known quality, the same durability thing for that, and the electability as long. Now, the thing is with Joe Biden, there are questions about, questions. Does anybody on the planet think that Joe Biden is as quick as he was 10, 15 years ago? Hell no, of course not. We all kind of, but, he is perceived widely in the Democratic Party as as the most electable. And in that 60%, that's like a huge thing. But here's the key for Biden. As long as he is perceived as the most electable, he's got a decent chance at this. But if he were to say or do something, or something were to happen that he is no longer seen as the most electable, whoosh. Trapdoor, boom, gone. I mean, that's where age, that's where, all these things would start coming back to roost, but it's the electability that's sort of been propping him up. So kind of looking at that, well, that's kind of interesting. Okay, so let's get now, I think that eventually Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, if you look over time, their totals have almost always totaled 35%. And there were times when Sanders has been high, and sometimes when Warren was higher, and then it's now Sanders. But it's always been around 35%. But let's round it up and go to 40. Okay. Among that other 60, there's a real resistance to either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. And I think there's actually more resistance to Bernie than Elizabeth among that 60 over here. Not because, Bernie actually has really good favorability ratings among Democrats, and even Democrats that aren't in that 40. It's not that they don't like him. Now, I would argue that a lot of them haven't met him yet. But anyway, it's not that they don't like him, but that, that they just question of whether he can win it or not. So Biden's this fragile front runner, 40-50%. But you know what Biden's biggest weakness is other than age? Money. He came to elected the Senate in 1972. He has never been a good fundraiser, ever. And in this era now of online fundraising is like everything, and which puts a premium on either ideological or having a niche. And where, like Pete Buttigieg, he's a pretty moderate guy and not too different from Biden in a lot of ideological issues, but part of the gay thing, so young, he's able to, he's actually done really, really, really well in fundraising, but Biden hasn't. He hasn't. Now, the chances of Joe Biden could win in Iowa. He could. He could come in second place. I'm not sure there's a great chance that he's going to come in first or second. But for a candidate that isn't raising much money, and right now of the four that are competing in February, he's in fourth place in fundraising, and Bernie's in first. And Buttigieg, Warren have been doing pretty well, though Warren's stock's down a little bit, so her FEC reports, numbers that come out this week are going to maybe sag a little. But the thing is, so Biden is a very, very, very fragile front runner. He's still a front runner, but oh boy, it's not on an eggshell, it's like a really thin eggshell. Now, Super Tuesday, March 3rd. Little inconsequential states: Alabama, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Massachusetts, Maine, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Virginia, Vermont. People that know campaigns, that know finances of campaigns, people that have run the finances of presidential campaigns before, tell me and I'm not a poker player, but the ante, is that where you get in at the very beginning of the game, for Super Tuesday is $100 million. $100 million for that day, and that's just to get in the game, and it could get ratcheted up. Wow. Bernie hadn't raised $100 million. I think Bernie will probably come in at having raised total, 60-something million probably for the calendar year. But guess what? They've spent most of it, just as all these other guys. They've spent, yes, some of them have raised a good bit of money, but it's mostly gone. And anybody that doesn't come in first or second, does really, really well in Iowa, New Hampshire, its fundraising is not going to get any easier. So this is like wow, this is really kind of interesting. Now, so hypothetically, let's say you had a candidate that was worth $55 to $60 billion. And let's say, the kids are gone, divorced, the kids are gone. He's pledged to give all of his money away sooner or later anyway. And he wasn't going to run because he came to the conclusion that an independent cannot possibly win a 270 electoral votes, so gave up on that. And then he looked and did a lot of polling research and decided, well, a billionaire businessman who made it on Wall Street is not what Democrats are looking for. I mean, he reached that conclusion and had decided to stay out. But then over the summer and early fall, he's watching Biden struggle, that Biden didn't collapse. He didn't fade, but wasn't exactly thriving either. So Biden was performing in an underwhelming way. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Warren is coming on like gangbusters. And, I think, and again, I haven't talked to him in 10 years, but I think, for Michael Bloomberg, I think it's safe to say that the most horrible thing that could possibly happen this year would be President Trump gets reelected. And if a Democrat were to get reelected, not too far behind that would be Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders getting elected president. That's sort of, they're not his peeps, So So he's looking at Biden not doing well. He's doing it Warren at the time. And just to kind of quantify that for a second, I had fun lunch, I think it was late September, maybe in early October, with 4 or 5 friends. And 4. Every one of them had been either the executive director or the political director of either the Democratic House or Senate campaign committees. They've run one of the largest super PACs in the country. They're people that have done this stuff big time. And I asked them at that time, lunch at the Palm, asked them, right now, if you had to say, who do you think is going to win the Democratic nomination? Every single one of them that day said Elizabeth Warren. Not one of them supported her, and not one of them thought it was a good idea. But, it really looked like that. Well, she's faded, and Bernie's now, picking on up. But the thing is, so you're Bloomberg, and you look at that and say, maybe I need to get back in. And because, Biden struck. Now, Warren had actually, just before he got in, kind of curled down, but he got in on like November 24th, 5th, 6th, something like that. So he says he's going to put $1 billion in. Now, I don't believe him because I think he's already done about $500 million, and we're over a month out from Super Tuesday, and I think he's going north of $1 billion. And the thing is, if he's doing well at all, I don't think he's going to, Michael Bloomberg is not going to lose the election because he's not going over $1 billion, if there's any progress at all. That ain't happening. Whether you go to 2, 3, 4, I don't know, but that's not going to happen. Now, he, as of last night, early last night, Bloomberg, his TV, cable, I think it includes digital buy, total, was at 273,852,209. Now, let's take Tom Steyer out, okay? I don't know what in the hell he's doing, but let's take Tom Steyer and his money and put it on the side, so that Bloomberg has spent far and away more than all of the others put together. And the thing is, and their money was going into Iowa, New Hampshire, so, okay. Now, put $1 billion into context. 2016, 17 Republican candidates, 3 Democratic candidates. Then you had Trump over here. Then you had Hillary Clinton over here, all spending Democrat, Republican, primary, general, everything. $1.5 billion. So $1 billion to win the nomination. I'm impressed. 2012, it was $1.4 billion. 2008, $1.6 billion. And to show you how good President George W. Bush's reelection campaign fundraising was, that year, all Democrats, Republicans, primary, $2.2 billion. But $1 billion or $2 billion, that's some serious change here. Now, you've got, anybody here saturation level advertising in just about all the Super Tuesday states and a bunch of the other March states. Now, some of you are saying the following. Okay, boy, I've blown the hell out of the agenda here, but thinking Democrats are never going to nominate a Wall Street billionaire. Look, I think it's a legitimate question whether the Democratic Party of this era would nominate anybody who's ever started or run a business, period. I mean, this is not, the days of Bill Clinton and Al Fromm's DLC is long gone. So, but the thing about it is, if a party really wants to win, and if someone don't even care who it is, they just want to win, and if Biden is not doing well, and if Biden doesn't begin to have the money to Biden would need to come in first place in both Iowa and New Hampshire. And I still don't think he could get $50 million to spend for Super Tuesday. I mean, because his money is going out the door as fast as it's going in. And it's not that much time. So maybe. Second thing is, the second reason people say is, you cannot win a nomination without competing in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. And I've said that before, and I would say just ask President Giuliani. And it's absolutely true that since 72, absolutely true. Everybody's come in, every nominee has come in the Democratic Party, first, second, and third in Iowa. Then they came in first or second in New Hampshire. The Iowa winner has won the nomination 4 times in a row. Absolutely true. But ask yourself this, why do these candidates spend all this money in 4 states that have 4% of the pledged delegates? Because the whole name of the game is you got to do well, strong showing. It's the political media capital of the world for a few weeks. You get the name you get the attention, the name recognition that you could leverage into money that go hitting Democratic donors around the country because they say, so that you can go to the other 46 states with 96% of the delegates. And you can look at the entire Bible, Old and New Testament, the Quran, the Torah, the Magna Carta, the U.S. Constitution. Nowhere does it say you have to compete in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. It's not there. There's a reason why everybody's done it. But if your fundraising operation is an 8x10 a picture of the candidate on a wall, then spending your entire budget competing for these, well, it kind of opens up new vistas and things. But the thing about it is, if you were going to say from the Bloomberg campaign perspective, from Bloomberg's perspective, what scenario did he need? He needed Biden. Biden, Klobuchar, we'll throw in Buttigieg for good measure, that they're not doing particularly well. Well, that box looks like it's pretty checkable. And the other is that either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or both are doing really, really well. So, look, I still think it's 40 to 50% chance that it's Biden, but I'll put 25% chance on Bloomberg. And one other little thing, going back to the Wall Street billionaire. I don't think there are a lot of people, Democrats aren't going to ever love the guy, but when you say, wait, he's hired 1,000 campaign workers, mostly in the field, in 30 states, and that the vast majority of the field staff have contracts that go through the November election, and most of the headquarters leases around the country go up through the election, and where he has said, these people are going to be working in these states whether I win the nomination or not, and was asked and said, even if it's Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, they're going to be doing this. Now, my guess is he almost wanted to retch when he said that last part, but that's anyway. So that could get some goodwill in the party, It's like, well, that's, I don't like Wall Street billionaires, and here's one last thing. I've not heard one single person say this. If Democrats win the White House, if they hold the House, and I think a pretty good chance they're going to hold the House, if they don't have a majority in the Senate, and particularly if Mitch McConnell, who's sort of smarter, whether you like him or not, he's smarter than the average bear, is the majority leader, here's a very, very limited amount that you can do. I mean, it's just really, really true. I mean, you can do some executive orders, you can do some things, but not much. Hypothetically, what if you were able to say, you know what, normally we'd be having to raise and spend X for a presidential general election. What if it didn't cost us a dime and actually was getting supplemented by some other outside place? And what if every dime of that could theoretically go into, say, winning a majority in the Senate? That's kind of interesting. You know, I think that thought would probably ruin Mitch McConnell's day because that majority is pretty fun. So anyway, the point of this is, I'm not saying, so in my 40-50% chance that it's Biden, fragile front runner, 20-25%. Bloomberg, just because I think the electability and this big piece over here, man, these people are not, you know, I think the big chunk of the parties, they're not going to go for Bernie or Elizabeth. And if they were going to go with one of them, I think Elizabeth Warren would be more acceptable than Bernie Sanders. I mean, they just can't close their eyes and visualize Bernie in the Oval Office and next to the military officer with the football. I mean, that's just not. And then, and the rest of it is Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Klobuchar, or whatever. Now, last thing, and I promise I'm going to stop. And if they'll let me do Q&A, I'll have to do Q&A. If not, I will stay here until 2:15 and answer and talk to anybody that wants to talk. Crap, what was I going to say? Hell, I don't even remember. All right. Can we take any question? We can. Okay. So let's just go to question. And I'm pretty sure we'll go right here. Pretty sure I'll come up with whatever I was about to say.
Kind of switching to more kind of the Senate campaign. What do you think of the general primary coming up in Georgia with Loeffler and Collins?
Wow. Well, the problem. The South, as a Louisianian, the South is kind of an interesting place, you know, and it's kind of an interesting place. There are places that have changed enormously, like, say, Virginia, that if it's not purple, it's more blue right now, and it was red not long ago. We're seeing North Carolina, Georgia. I mean, Stacey Abrams come within a point. I mean, we're seeing places. Look at Texas. We're seeing changes, and Arizona's not technically South, but a lot of this is people from other parts of the country are moving in, and they're not Southerners. Excuse me? Carpetbaggers. Yeah, they're not Southerners. You know, who's here from North Carolina? What is Cary? C-A-R-Y. The suburb of Raleigh. What does that stand for? Containment area for relocated Yankees. I heard that over here. They're like, nobody's a Southern. I mean, but in the Research Triangle and Charlotte and Atlanta and Dallas and Houston and Austin and San Antonio and stuff. So you got states that are changing big time. Different paces, but changing. And then you've got my beloved state of Louisiana. You've got where my parents are from, Arkansas, where my wife was born, Mississippi. I could throw in Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina. They're not changing a bit, not a bit, because they don't have the influx of outsiders nationalizing the place. Now, the problem that I think North Carolina is, I would say it's the fourth. Some people are saying third. I think it's the fourth best shot for Democrats in the Senate. You know, I think you could get into an argument over, I'll do these in alphabetical order, Arizona, Colorado, Maine. But those three, McSally, Gardner, and Susan Collins, man, you know, really, 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 really vulnerable. That's 5 reallys. Okay, and I wouldn't say any of them are gone, but it's uphill. The fourth one would be North Carolina, and the fourth one would be North Carolina, Tillis. And the question is, do Democrats have, is whoever they're going to end up with going to be a good candidate to take advantage of it? But where the state's changing, so Tillis. Now, Georgia, that's some candidate. I mean, the question is, can Democrats, for the Purdue, the 6-year, or the jungle primary, where Kelly Loeffler, you saw Doug Collins jumped in, or is jumping in. I think we've got to wait and see sort of not just who gets in, but how they're doing. I mean, like, you just have this minister of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, Reverend King's old church. I don't know the guy, I've never seen him, but there was a long time that I didn't think Stacey had much of a chance, and then towards the end, it's like, holy mackerel. So I don't think we know, but I think that's after the short seat would be probably 5, and Purdue, Joni Ernst, Cornyn. Now, one other thing here. If Republicans in Kansas nominated a potato, they'd hold the seat fine. But former Secretary of State Chris Kobach, maybe not. And with Pompeo announcing that he's not running, right now Chris Kobach, it takes a lot of effort if you're a Republican to blow a governor's race in Kansas. That takes, you have to work overtime to do that. That's one that I'm not jumping out there, because I still, even though Pompeo said a couple weeks ago that he's not going to do it, I still think there's an X% chance that Pompeo doubles back. I really, really do. Number one, the filing deadline's not until June. The chance of Republicans losing that seat are really, really, really high if Pompeo or somebody isn't going to be able to beat Kobach. I mean, beating Kobach in the primary, that'd be the problem. They'd win the general, no problem. So that's the sort of the one. I still think Pompeo may jump back. And I think part of it would be, do I think there's going to be a second Trump term or not? I mean, because I think he wants to run for president, next time, 24. So we can see Pompeo and Nikki Haley and whoever else, but Pence and. But anyway, so I don't know, but I tell you what, the way I look at the Senate is, I don't know. I've never met Doug Jones. I'm sure he's a smart guy. I'm sure he's a fine guy. All that. I hope he rented and didn't buy a place here. Okay, so. In other words, so Democrats need to gross 4 seats to net 3 if they're going to have the White House, because otherwise, they got 47, but if they lose Alabama, that drops them back to 46. And I think between Arizona, Maine, Colorado, I think there is a fabulous chance that Democrats win 2 of those. I think it's a really good chance they win all 3. But the thing is, that would still only get them to 49. They don't need a wave to get to 49. But getting North Carolina, now that's where Kansas is sort of hanging out here over here. But winning North Carolina, either Georgia, Texas, beating Joni Ernst in Iowa, they need a tailwind to get the next seat. Now, here's the kick. They need the tailwind or Chris Kobach to be the Republican nominee. I mean, that's what they'd need. And then the other thing is, but they wouldn't need a tsunami wave. The wave we had in November of 2018, that wave, where the national vote from 2016 basically picked up and moved over 6 points from right to left, and where you had Democrats picking up all this, doing incredibly well in suburban areas. And yeah, they did badly in red Republican small town rural states, which were huge in 2018 in the Senate, but not so much in 2020 Senate picture. So if they could just replicate 2018, I think you'd have a Democratic Senate. Now, right now, I mean, we don't know, but if you did look at the generic congressional ballot test, I mean, and the thing is, it doesn't tell you. It tells you, is the wind blowing? Which direction is it blowing? And is it going light, moderate, or heavy? A little iffy, but you could do that. I mean, that's all it tells you. Right now, it's basically 6, 7 points, which is basically where it was in November of 2018. Just saying. So, now, the Senate is, I mean, our politics is now so much more parliamentary. There's very little ticket splitting going on. There's some, but very, very, very little. And we're getting nationalized. And 2016 was the first election since we started the direct election of senators in 1914, the first election where every single U.S. Senate race was won by the same party as was carrying that state in the presidential race that night. All of them. Never happened. Then you go to 2018. 79% of the Senate races were won by the party that had won that state 2 years earlier. So you can, and so the value of being like a really good candidate, an independent, go to swing voters, that you could survive a bad year, that's less true. Political science say that incumbency advantage and the things that incumbents can do is watered down so much because partisanship has taken on. And if the partisanship is working in your favor in your district or state, man, that's awesome. But if it's not, you're not. And that's why you can look at, Heidi Heidkamp and Joe Donnelly and stuff. They ought to be able to sleep fine at night. Because in retrospect, there was not, and I might say that for Claire McCaskill, maybe. But the thing is, at least for certainly 2 of those, there's not a damn thing they could have done differently. They would have had a different outcome. Not a bit. Hell, if they'd changed parties, they'd have lost a Republican primary. So, I mean, there wasn't a thing. Yes, sir. Okay, I'm about to get thrown out of here. But
Could you speak a little bit more about the influence and impact of women? Because if you listen to the Democrats, they will say that women are their benchmark, and African American women are really that place. But when you look at where the votes have been and where women have netted out on some of these races, I think it will have a greater impact. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact?
Well, the thing about it is, I think if you had Joe or Jane, generic Republican president in the White House, I don't think there'd be the slightest problem in the world. I personally don't think there'd be the slightest problem in the world for a Democrat winning, a woman winning the Democratic nomination. And look, I think there are a lot of reasons why Hillary Clinton lost. And look, when you lose the presidency by 78,000 votes out of 137 million, you can probably come up with a list of 36 things. Showing up in Wisconsin would have been, that's already, the word deplorable was probably good for 500,000 votes. I mean, just we could come up with polling in individual states in the last 3 weeks rather than analytics. Anyway, I shouldn't have that. But anyway, but that's where is the question is this year is different, but how different is it? But I think we are minimum of 4 or 8 years away from a very legitimate question is, can a guy win a Democratic presidential nomination? Because of, yeah, go ahead.
So you have this impact now where, given the issues around women and the issues around the Republican Party and the president, and yet there still seems to be this movement where women continue to vote for the president or those issues.
No.
What's that impact?
Well, First, what we were seeing, emphasis on past tense, that the upscale women, first of all, minority women were already done. Upscale college educated suburban, moving heavily this way. In 2016 and 17 into 18 a little bit, working class women were voting a whole lot like working class men. Not quite as Republican, but pretty damn close. Working class women were much more like working class men than they were with women in general or non-working class women. They were sometime late 2018 and in 19, you started seeing working class white women with less than 40, they started moving away from the president. And the thing is, I think the cultural stuff was geography, culture, education. All these things were working to hang on to working class women for President Trump. And I just think it's maybe for a bunch of those people, at some point there was a straw that broke the camel's back. Or to, keep going with the cliches, a bridge too far. And they started behaving more like women than they were behaving more like working class. So to me, that's kind of an interesting thing. I'm getting a hook here. I tell you what, Kevin, you walk up here and I'll answer this question while you're walking, okay?
Please take the question.
I'm really glad you asked that because there was a time when the gap, and there are elections where the gap between registered voters and likely voters is fairly substantial. And 2018, that didn't happen. And I don't think it's going to happen. I think right now, for the immediate future, I think registered voters and likely voters are the same thing because turnout's going to be so darn high across the board that it basically just means the pool of voters, the likely voters and registered voters, the overlap is was so high that you don't even have to worry much about screening for likely voters. You just go with registered voters. And the other thing is it kind of bites you on the rear end when you do too much of that because if people vote in unusually high numbers and you're modeling for history, and that's where I had the beef with, like Moody Analytics and a lot of these econometric models that are, first of all, they're how's the economy compared to how it's been for the last 50 years. Well, that's fine. I'm not arguing about the 35. I'm just talking about that it's changed now. And so, but this time, I don't think there's going to be much of a gap at all. And that was why, actually, the great thing is that polling in 2018, it was fabulous. It was just dead on. It was awesome. It was great. And it kind of made up for at least what was wrong or the impression that things were wrong in 2016. But so polling ought to be really, really good this time. And one other thing that, good pollsters are already calling cell phones and stuff. So the thing about, a cell phone, that's not the problem. The problem is caller ID. That's what, is that when I worked in polling way back, you make 100 phone calls and you'd get 25 completions. Today, if you do 100 calls, you might get 6, which makes polling incredibly expensive. Enormously expensive. The saving grace so far is an unknown number calls our house or my wife's cell phone, and if she doesn't know who it is, she's not picking it up. It just goes straight to cell phone. Straight voice. I will pick it up because if my kid's bleeding in a ditch and a good Samaritan's calling to say, "Hey, you ought to," I want to get that. But the thing is, the political attitudes, the partisanship and ideology of people that won't pick up that call aren't any different from the ones that will. So that's actually been the saving grace. But people that are moving to online for political polling, let me just say, and we've experimented, done some work with, is nobody's doing that for quality. They're doing that for cost. I mean, they will deny it, I promise you. But there actually is some really good online polling, but the catch is, it's as expensive as telephone interviewing. And I'll just say that 95% of the online polling that you see here around politics, I should figure out what the acronym CRAP, come up with, it's not the good stuff. Let's just put it that way, okay? Anyway, I'll hang out and talk to the rest of you, but I apologize for chewing up way more time than I was supposed to, and I'm not sure whether Kevin's going to be unhappy with me or not. But anyway, I thoroughly enjoyed it. You guys are great. Thanks for what you do. Thanks for your support.
I'm sorry. Appreciate it, man. Well, thank you all for coming. Please grab a snack on your way back to your office, and we look forward to seeing you all throughout the year. Thank you.